Hello, my friends. Jeff Salzman here, and welcome to the Daily Evolver. Today, I am here with Corey DeVos, Editor-in-Chief of Integral Life. Hey, Corey, how you doing, man?
Hey, my man. Another day in paradise.
That's right. Yes. Good to have you with us, and good to have all of you listening and watching. And Integral Life, of course, is the host of the live webcast, and I appreciate that so much. And I encourage everybody to check out Integral Life, the main Integral portal in the world, and to become a member if you are so inclined. All right, so today I want to take a look at some of the feedback that I've been getting from listeners and viewers. And I have to say that I really do love when I hear from you people and what I hear from you people. And I have to say I have really good listeners. I mean, a lot of it's very positive. It's very encouraging to me. But there's also a lot of it that just, sort of tries to correct thinking or adds something to it. And it really helps me to grow in my own integral process. And I want to encourage that. There's a couple ways for you to get in touch with me. One is just good old jeff@dailyevolver.com. And you can also send a voice memo to that address. And then I can play it live. I'm going to play some live today here. And then the other is to go to my website, dailyevolver.com, and you can leave a message there. There's a little orange button that's part of a speak pipe thing. You press it, and it's very simple. And that's a way of talking to me, too. So the feedback I'm going to share today all sort of lines up around a bigger theme. And it's interesting when I read comments, how these themes emerge. And today the theme is just the sense of what is it to move into integral consciousness, integral functioning. How does that feel different? How does that look different? What's the experience of moving a vertical stage of development? If integral theory is correct, integral consciousness is as different from postmodern consciousness, which precedes it, and modern consciousness, which precedes it, as they are from each other. And there's radical new capacities that arise as we enter integral. And I got some really good descriptions of that. So I'm going to start with an audio that I got from a listener, relatively new listener, as he'll explain, from my Daily Evolver Speak Pipe. And this is an audio from Tom Van Galen. And I think all I need to do is press the share screen.
Hi, Jeff. This is Tom Van Galen from up here in Canada. Have been tracking with you and some of the other integralists in the world for about, I'm going to say, year and a half now. Like, seriously, I'd heard of spiral dynamics probably 4 or 5 years ago, had looked into it and found it interesting, but didn't get it. Lo and behold, well, there's a much longer story here, but about a year and a half ago, had an awakening, I guess, in which suddenly integral theory became much more vibrant and very clear and full colored, made the world seem very 3D to me. All
right. That's an oft-told story. And that does describe, in Tom's own way, how that feels. There's an actual, it feels like an awakening. It is. It's a state change, but it's also a stage change. There's a vertical movement that's happening in terms of stages of development. And Ken Wilber, who so many of us have been so deeply inspired by, in terms of in my case, a capital T teacher. He describes this in his book, Integral Spirituality. I'm going to just read 2 paragraphs from what he says, where he talks about integral being psychoactive. He said, a truly integral framework is not an inert map. It's a psychoactive map. It's a psychoactive system that goes through your entire body-mind and begins to activate any potentials that are not presently being used. Once you download the integral operating system, it's simply and almost automatically beginning to look for areas that the integral map suggests you possess, but that you might not have consciously realized until the framework activates them, lights them up, and makes you realize that you have all of these possibilities in your own being. If you have read this far, and this is page 299 in Integral Spirituality, if you have read this far, the integrative process is already activated in you, and you likely understand just what this means. And I would say the same thing about people who continue to listen to the Daily Evolver. You know, if what I'm talking about here makes sense, if what Ken was just talking about makes sense, if what Tom was talking about makes sense, or it hits the spot in some way, then the integrative process is already activated in you. And until that happens, it isn't. You know, it's just like Tom said, you know, we all have our stories about this. He read integral, he read spiral dynamics, didn't quite get it. And then you get it. And then there's a sort of a capital G getting it. And again, until that happens, the whole thing, if somebody's trying to tell you about it or sell you on it, it's a little bit annoying. and I think there's really two categories of critiques that people who haven't really gotten integral consciousness, that they have of it. One is that it's just gobbledygook. You know, it's just too much jargon and too many colors and graphs. And, you know, it would be like me trying to understand quantum physics, which I have tried to do. I tried to read Stephen Hawking. God knows I did. I'm one of those people who bought A Brief History of Time and got to page 2, you know. And so, you know, there is, so there's just that. It just doesn't make any sense until it does. And the other is that it has so many taxonomies and hierarchies, which we consider growth hierarchies, natural hierarchies, but still there's a lot of antibodies to that whole sort of intellectualizing of reality that people, particularly in green, have, and I had it too, and still do in a way. So this is an email I got from Julie last night, actually, and she writes about this. She says, I have to admit that sometimes integral is way too intellectual for me. It seems everyone just likes to name things, to identify things using integral terminology. In this podcast, in your podcast, just talked about a podcast I did, I heard your process rather than heard your terminology. So thank you for that. You showed examples of an integration and how appropriate natural integration is built into the human cosmic system of creation. And I can't imagine getting, you know, a better piece of positive feedback, because that's exactly what I'm trying to do here with the Daily Evolver, is create an on-ramp where people can not only think their way forward, but also sort of feel and inhabit their way forward, to grow their way forward. And, you know, there's sort of a feeling that once you realize that growth is built into the system, as Julie says, then you can actively and consciously participate in that growth of the cosmos and of your own piece of it. And so that's great. The second thing I would say is probably a necessary defense of all the taxonomies and jargon and all that stuff. And, you know, I would just say, think of it as a map. And if you are exploring new territory, a new continent that you don't know much about, the better your map is and the more detailed it is, then the more likely you are going to be able to stay there and take up residency. So that is, so that's a, a defense of that. But again, it just sort of arrives. We don't have to make it happen. It's like a 9-year-old doesn't have to work really hard to become a 10-year-old. He just has to be fed and watered, and the growth takes care of itself. And that's true for us as evolving adults as well. All right, so here's another take on how it feels. And this is from Jenny. Let's see if I can make this work. And I think I can. Okay, all right, so hang on, I'm gonna share screen again so you could hear it. Okay, here we go.
You've done, certainly with this work on Jordan Peterson. I just wanted to say you have a way of taking my disarray of thoughts and pointing them in the integral direction and taking them further, taking me further along a path that I find so helpful to my survival in this weird and wonderful place. Thank you again.
And I love that. Again, that's what I'm trying to do here. And that disarray of thought that Jenny's talking about, it feels like that. That's sort of the end of the first tier where it's all just sort of confused, and everything's online, and there's a lot online for people who are at modern and postmodern and all of these earlier stages, and it is confusing. And then it begins to fly in formation. And what is happening is that we actually have a bigger space of consciousness, and it's radically different than the earlier stages again. And that doesn't mean that we're not still human beings and we're not still navigating this world and navigating new territories. But all of a sudden, we can see the system of thought, the worldview that we used to be limited by. And as we say in Integral, what was subject, in other words, what was me, what was my identity, what was Jeff, suddenly becomes the object of a bigger subject, a bigger Jeff who could see that other Jeff and could see all of the other Jeffs that came before him and can contain them all in this new, bigger identity. And it comes on in a couple stages. Integral itself comes on in a couple stages. We talk about moving into Teal, which is sort of entry-level Integral in the sense of it sees this. It sees evolution, it sees development, it sees it in our own interiors, it sees it in culture, it sees it in third person in terms of technology. And it begins to categorize. And this is where we really go crazy with the taxonomies, because all of a sudden everything fits and we want to figure out where it fits, and it's all so fun. And it's that simplicity beyond complexity, where it's just a new order of organization and of integration, of evolution. And so that's the Teal level. And then the Turquoise level is the sort of a more mature Integral, where you sort of, as Ken says, it's like you have the head with heart now, and you feel it. And you look at history and you look at evolution and what science tells us about the origins of the universe, and you think, oh my God, this thing is alive. This thing is alive, this thing is intelligent, and this thing is living me. I'm not just living it. I'm living it too, but it's also living me. And that is, this new, bigger identity. And it's psychoactive, indeed. And I would also say, and just to put it all in perspective, that every stage is psychoactive. When you first hit it, I could remember my own growth. As I was a little kid, I was chaotic. I was, up to 5, 6, 7, I'm running around, I'm exploring the world, I'm not overthinking, I'm not thinking too far ahead, I'm trying to get what I want, I'm crying when I don't. It's the whole thing that we do as kids And that's sort of, human history has that same quality too, a lot of it, back before, we're civilized into a traditional worldview. And that happens as individuals. Well, for me, it happened, I'm thinking third grade, age 8, 9, all of a sudden, all of that wasn't enough. It was boring. It was, I'd done enough of that. And I suddenly had a realization, and this is again, a capital R realization in my book, that I was living in a bigger world than I thought. I was living in a bigger world than I had been limited to. And that actually, I was living in a great kingdom created by Almighty God, and where I was loved by Jesus. And, I expanded and I breathed in great drafts of space, as Whitman would say, of this transcendent good and evil, and the world reorganized around those two poles. And, like everybody else, I wanted to be good. And I always love the teachings of Trungpa Rinpoche, where he talks about basic goodness, not basic evil, basic goodness, because that's what we want. We don't always do it, and humanity doesn't always do it. But, those were the years when, I tried to do my chores without being asked. I was a Boy Scout, I was a devoted little Christian boy. I helped my grandma rake her leaves. And then, finally that became limiting. And, I moved into orange modernity, and I realized that the religion doesn't quite explain it, that, God created the 6 days, the whole thing. I don't know. I'm going with science, and that's a new world, and that's psychoactive. And it's not just intellectual. It's a whole, 4-quadrant affair. And we move up there, and then that's not enough. Science isn't enough, and it's deadening. And I want sensitivity, and I want sex and gay sex and drugs and rock and roll, and that's my move into green. And so that feels psychoactive. It, in some cases, literally was psychoactive, as I was doing some of those substances that brought that on, and there we go. And so with Integral, it's kind of the same thing, where all of a sudden, we're not so limited by our postmodern identity or our modern identity. We become more interested in the people that we had been demonizing, the people that we thought were, losers or stupid or co-opted or whatever we thought. Our enemies, our ideological enemies, become a little more interesting to us. And as we work with that, and at Integral, we do that as a practice. We take on the perspective of other people, particularly people who are annoying us. And we get in their skin, and we look out their eyes, and we do that as a practice. And, we do that imperfectly. We do it not to get it right. We do it to be faithful in a way. But eventually, we stop identifying with any single perspective or worldview in the way that we had. And we start identifying, again, with this bigger space within which perspectives are arising, within which worldviews are there, fully formed and available to us. And we realize that this bigger space has qualities of a loving intelligence that organizes them for us. Again, all of a sudden it flies in formation. It's like we didn't have to try, that it's just all there in a new organization. And that's, called being multi-perspectival and having flex flow vision logic. That's, well mapped in terms of adult development. So, so that's, how that feels. And I love what Jenny said about it. So the last thing I want to share is an email that I got from another listener, longtime listener, and who writes me often, and I always appreciate his stuff, Tom Albertson. And he was commenting on, I think, the last episode I did on Trump's war cabinet drops a developmental level, where I was sort of bemoaning this ascendancy of John Bolton, who I really do consider to be dangerous, especially in combination with Donald Trump. And I made this case, and And Tom writes me, and he has, first of all, it's funny, God bless him. He has this like 2 or 3 lines about here, I thought you did a great job, really love Tom. And then this big long PS, the first paragraph of which is underlined.
Can I just say, Jeff, that is one of the common qualities of integral consciousness, is that your PS all of a sudden becomes like 5 times longer.
Yes, I agree. You're right. Thank you. That is a feature of this thinking. And so he writes, and he says, okay, P.S. I challenge you to produce just 1 episode of your show without interpreting / labeling something we don't like or that vexes us as a, quote, problem, unquote. And instead, to interpret that same situation from a true second-tier perspective. In the same way you did when you reminded us that a 9-year-old is not a defective 12-year-old, and therefore isn't a problem. He says, misapplying the simple problem-solving framework, and I love that, misapplying the problem-solving framework, which is the framework of first-tier memes, misapplying it to a highly divergent, multiplayer, multi-perspectival challenge that arises in a complex context would be like sitting in a high-end French restaurant and demanding a bottle of Heinz ketchup. And I resemble that remark, but at any rate, he goes on, and I love this last part. He says, in the orientation of the creative, and that's the new orientation. So we're moving from the idea if there's something wrong, there's a deficiency in every stage of the first 6 stages. And then as we move into integral, we move into a sort of a creative orientation of the world. So that's what he's talking about. He says again, in the orientation of the creative, recall, we work with whatever shows up in our circumstances, making sure we know the full truth about our current circumstances as they relate to our vision, and embrace all of the circumstances as welcome and necessary input into the creative process moving forward. This is much more fun, effective, and empowering second-tier game to play. This is a much more fun, effective, and empowering second-tier game to play than the depressing, ineffective, first-tier problem-solving game. So, dang, Tom. I think that's really beautiful and right on, and is an example, and not the only one, I have to say, of my listeners being farther along the path than I am. And I mean that. And that is, I could feel the transmission right now in this moment of Tom's, insight. And indeed, we are moving from, just to put it in real simple language, we're moving from a fear operating system to a love operating system as we move into integral and into second tier. Again, every first tier meme has some story of how this shouldn't be happening. It's awful that it is. I can't stand it. Somebody needs to be blamed or condemned. It's probably me. It might be them. It's this whole project of fixing things. Versus the creativity or the love operating system, where we accept the world as it is and join in the project of perfecting it in our own way, in our own little corner, however we are called to do that, but with love in our heart. And the hesitation to this, and the reason why people have trouble taking up a solid residency in this new operating system is because, we have millennia of fear, hundreds of millennia of fear behind us. And we know that fear is a more reliable and immediately powerful force than love is, at least in the sort of on-the-ground applications that we're working on right now, which is where we feel like we're going completely off the ditch and over the cliff. And so people resist that message that the world is evolving to goodness, truth, and beauty and all of that stuff that I talk about, largely because they are afraid that that's going to bring on a complacency. And if I lay down my sword, then I'm defenseless and I'm useless, basically. And there is a realization, and I'm not, Tom's further along than I am here, but there is this realization that love contains everything. It contains power, it contains fierceness, it contains ruthlessness sometimes if called for. It contains intelligence, it contains sensitivity. It contains actually everything in the whole human smorgasbord except fear. And that itself is a practice, you know, that realization. And, you know, and so instead of this shouldn't be happening, it's awful that it is, it's a new radical acceptance. This should be happening, not in the sense that it should be happening, but it is happening. So I guess therefore it should be happening because I want to be friendly to reality. And I want to live in reality as it is. And that radical acceptance, the piece we have to remember that it means also radical engagement and radical resistance when called for, but not the fear and the condemnation and the vexation and the gnashing of teeth and all of the stuff that I still do plenty of. And I think I still will when it comes to John Bolton. But at any rate, I know where I'm going and I'm working on it. So I just want to say thank you, Tom, for, you know, pulling us along. So yeah, that's it. You know, we want to look at this movement of consciousness that we all think we're engaged in and we see and feel and find in each other and all of that good stuff. And because that itself is the engine of continued evolution. It's that we are more consciously involved, that we are seeing more, that we're including more in our circle of what we're aware of. And that is growth that happens at every stage. And at Integral, it has its own special blessing and thrill. And so I'm happy to share that with you. All right. So, Corey, you hear this stuff all the time. What are you thinking, my man?
Yeah, a few things. First off, beautiful descriptions, Jeff.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's such an important conversation because, you know, the quality of being integral, it's a little bit different depending on where on the path you sort of are, right? So I started getting into Ken's work when I was 19 years old.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. So you were an early adopter like me.
Yeah, pretty early.
Yeah.
You know, and you know, I sort of had this spontaneous spiritual implosion. Definitely not a love and light type experience. It was very powerful, sort of flipped me inside out, deconstructed me, and left me sort of in a pile. And I had to start sort of reconstructing myself. And fortunately, I found Ken's work about 6 months into that process and has guided me, you know, basically throughout my entire adult development. And I have so much gratitude that I, you know, found Ken's work when I did, because, you know, my memory of that time was there were so many doorways that I could have walked through. And so many of those doorways really do lead into, you know, some blind alleys. And I feel like I had saved myself in retrospect. I feel like I've saved myself so much time and energy by sort of, you know, finding Ken. And I'll always remember, you know, I was in a Barnes and Noble in, geez, must have been 1997, 96. And walking through the New Age section, as a lot of, you know, new journeymen do. And I saw the spine of the book, A Brief History of Everything. I was like, what an arrogant title, Jesus Christ. Who in the right mind would would title a book A Brief History of Everything? And I pulled it out and I looked at Ken's face on the cover. I was like, oh, okay, that guy looks like he can write a book called. And I remember thinking, he looks like Superman on chemotherapy. You know, he totally had that look to him. And anyway, and that started sort of my integral adventure. And, for me, it's been a really long process,
Well, let me just interrupt for a second, just to say that I want to note that you talked about feeling like a disintegration, often the end of a stage is sort of feels that way. It's depressing. You're done with it. You're sick of it. And so, there is a dark night to each of these stages. In fact, Ken actually mapped that out. I forget which one is which, but it's true. And so, so I just want to say that. And then you found the brief history of everything. And then how did it engage, and, how did it go for you from then on?
Yeah, well, so, I basically immersed myself. I started into, and I completely immersed myself. I pulled every book by Ken Wilber. I started combing through his bibliography, reading as much of those, as I possibly could. And it started this process of, I love how you and, how Ken describes the integral map as psychoactive. And that's exactly what it felt like. I started, memorizing the map. And what that did was sort of over time, I could feel this accumulation, like there was this, I could always feel the gear works kind of turning away in the back of my head, sort of in my unconscious. And slowly, and it began as sort of a clumsy thing where I'd look at a piece of information, a piece of data, or read a book or a perspective or what have you. And then I'd have to, consciously okay, let's push this through, some version of the 4 quadrants. And let's, it was a very deliberate sort of effort.
Exactly.
Over a span of, a long time. I mean, stage transitions take a long time. And honestly, I was getting into Ken's work when I was, really sort of starting to hit bright green. Right. So it sort of, guided me through green in a certain way. And I think sort of kept me honest in a sort of way as I was going through that stage, so that I could pop out the other side, maybe 10, 15 years later. I don't really think I started embodying sort of the more second tier values and wisdoms of integral until I was, really into my 30s and had begun my integral career and was surrounded by integral peers and all of that.
Well, you were hardcore. You moved out to Boulder, and
I moved here just to work. I mean, it got to the point. Yeah, I
drank the Kool-Aid.
Yeah, well, and at that point in time, I actually had a very amber relationship with integral. So everything was sort of disintegrating around me, and all that was left was this desire to be part of something that was bigger than myself. It was this return to. It was this sort of consolidation, right, back to an amber identity that I had never really been able to cultivate as a child. Well, this became it for me. This became like, this is my bodhisattva vow. I'm going to bend my life around proselytizing, this big, beautiful vision that has served me so much. So that's what I did. I ended up moving out to Boulder, Colorado on a whim. I didn't have a place to live. I was homeless for the first week I was out here, all with the purpose of, meeting Ken Wilber and, sort of getting involved with the Integral Project and all that. And, after a couple years, it started to take off, and here I am. But, I think what I want to point to is, for me, and this is what's interesting about answering this question, Jeff, and why I love the way you answered it is, there's as many answers to this question as there are cosmic addresses that are, sort of coming into the integral stage. And all of us are going to answer it, slightly differently and sort of have different flavors and different accents and all that. But there's some patterns that really run through, I think, all of our experiences. And you did a really good job of laying out what those were. And for me, it's interesting, oftentimes when we talk about stage development, we think about it as a very sort of ascending process. It's literally an ascending, we're climbing a ladder, and we make it to integral, and, hopefully with any luck, we continue evolving. But for me, in terms of the lifelong embodiment of integral, for me, it was largely a descending process, because it began with Ken's intellectual works, which expanded my mind, which allowed me to, using Ken's metaphors, download the integral operating system to the point where I could feel it churning away in the background of my consciousness, even when it wasn't at the forefront of my consciousness.
Right.
And that was...
Go on, Terry.
Well, so I think what that did was, as you mentioned, learning this map helps you, you know, I think one of the major benefits of learning the integral map is that it helps you be more curious, naturally curious. There's this curiosity that comes online because it's, you know, again, it's a psychoactive map that's itself inviting you directly into the territory. So suddenly you become a lot more interested in other people's experiences and other perspectives. And you begin to take those perspectives. You know, at first you take some sort of like my imagining of these perspectives. You know, it starts off as almost like, here's my caricatured version of your perspective. But as the process sort of takes root, you know, I think you start to get a more kind of authentic, empathetic access to, you know, these other points of view. And that itself, you know, again, it's a descending process for me anyway. It's been a descending process. The expanding mind, the expanded capacity to take perspectives, that ends up expanding your heart.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and also descending in the sense that we consolidate and actually do rehabilitation on a lot of these earlier stages that we didn't really, that are still.
All that, yeah, all that undigested meat, you begin to sort of be able to locate it, and you can see, you know, I can be like, oh,
especially, you know, your generation, I think, who get, you know, hauled up into green real quick.
Yeah.
Without getting the other layers installed.
Yeah, and Jeff, I'm actually gonna, you know, put a little nuance on that and say we're enculturated with a lot of green language that we learn how to use before we even hit a green cognition. So so that's why I think this conversation is so important, because it has so much less to do with what kind of idioms you use, what sort of, you know, what kind of jargon you draw from. It goes so much further than the language you're using to communicate whatever it is you're trying to communicate. You really have to start looking at the quality of consciousness that is producing, you know, that communication in the first place. Because, you know, there's a lot of, and I was this guy. There's a lot of orange memorizing integral maps and using it purely as sort of a new taxonomy where I can locate and identify everything. And that's great for what it does. And I think that's great because that process itself invites you. It sort of leads you into a deeper enactment of this material.
Well, and that's the Teal to Turquoise move too.
Yeah, I think so. And again, that descending, you know, by that increased capacity to take perspectives, that expands your heart. The heart always seems to, I think, follow, you know, cognition usually leads these things. And then our values, our self-identity, our self-worth, all of that sort of follows behind. And with that expanded integral heart, you know, that's where I think, you know, one of Ken's most beautiful transmissions, hurts more, bothers you less, really starts to come into play. And, you know, this was sort of my response to Tom's thing is, you know, I think we get into trouble when we begin to sort of privilege either side of that street and we lose sight of the other. Because when you hit integral, when you have the capacity for, you know, again, this integrative consciousness where you can see more, well, that means you feel more. And when you feel more, it fucking hurts, right? And it hurts deeply. I mean, and it's a toothpaste you can't put back into the tube. You can't close your eyes to you know, the suffering, the ongoing moment-to-moment suffering that people endure, whether or not you've hit this big, beautiful integral consciousness or not.
And when you do, you're aware of it.
That's right. And if you get trapped in that suffering, then, you know, I think like the commenter said, you can sort of get trapped into this perpetual game of lack and scarcity and fear and all of that. At the same time, if you overprivilege the other side of the street, the bothers you less, I mean, that's an on-ramp for all sorts of spiritual bypassing and for us to sort of glibly deny or overlook or, you know, sort of compartmentalize, you know, that suffering that actually happens. And I think that it's within that expanded, tenderized, integral heart that we begin to, some of these paradoxes and contradictions start to get resolved a little bit. or at least invite you into, deeper reflection, which then yields, a greater wisdom. And all of that, I think, serves the next sort of descending current, which is to enact this in your gut, right? In your balls or your ovaries or whatever it might be, and to, really get your hands on the world. Because it's sort of the fruit of this process where, again, you begin by memorizing what I would say the constructs of integral thought, which then leads you into a deeper understanding of what integral thinking is. And I think that's the much more interesting conversation, because it's the integral thinking that produces integral maps in the first place. That in a sense is a lot more useful than any integral map you could possibly ever memorize. And that helps align, I think, head, heart, and gut in a way that really makes you a much more powerful...
Integrated.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. Yeah.
Right
yeah,
on.
and it makes you a more, you're able to move the needle. You're able to show up in your life and in the world around you that much more because of, that process. Yeah.
Right on, Corey. And thanks, man. That's a good testimony of, your own, journey here. And I would just sort of close the loop here by just reminding us that this is a practice, where we have this, amazing body of work that helps us sort of map the territory. But living there is a practice. And I always love the definition of practice. It's the thing we do to be faithful, not successful. But then we are successful. So anyway, funny how that works. So thank you, my man.
Thank you, brother.
Yes, indeed. Again, thank you, Integral Life, for hosting the live webcast, and join the daily or the Integral Life community, and check out the dailyevolver.com and forward it to your friends. And I guess it's important that you like it in these buttons. And so like me.
And share us.
Yes, and share us or whatever. So anyway, the viewership is really building, and it's really so gratifying. And I love hearing from you. It's so interesting how this feedback sort of coheres around these various issues, and it's just so much fun and such a privilege to deal with it with you. So,
and you're right, Jeff. We really do have the best viewers out there.
It's true.
Yep.
It's true.
They're smarter than we are. They're more passionate than we are. They're just better than us in most ways. So.
Yes, indeed.
Yep.
So keep it coming. Thanks, folks. We'll be back next time for another edition of the Daily Evolver.